March 1941, Louisiana-Texas border. The United States Army is running its largest military exercise since the First World War. Nearly 400,000 troops are involved. The outcome will decide who commands America's armies in the war everyone knows is coming. In Washington, General George C. Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, is watching closely. He is not impressed by theatrics. He is looking for men who understand modern war, speed, logistics, coordination, and initiative. One general does something unforgivable. He violates exercise boundaries, crosses into Texas without authorization, ignores umpire rulings, disrupts communications, and collapses an entire enemy rear area in a matter of hours. On paper, it is illegal. By doctrine, it is cheating. Politically, it should end his career. Instead, it saves him. This is the story of how George S. Patton, already controversial, narrowly escaped Marshall's quiet purge, not because he was liked, but because removing him would have been more dangerous than tolerating him. And it all begins with 3 words Patton casually uttered before breaking the rules: play ball. By early 1941, the United States Army faced an uncomfortable truth. It had no recent experience commanding large modern forces. Europe was already burning. Germany had crushed Poland and France with speed no American doctrine had fully anticipated. General George C. Marshall, appointed Chief of Staff in September 1939, understood that America's biggest weakness was not equipment, it was leadership. Promotions had stagnated. Many senior officers were relics of trench warfare thinking. Marshall's solution was ruthless but quiet. He organized the Louisiana maneuvers, later expanding them into Texas, not merely to test units, but to identify and remove slow-thinking generals before war made removal impossible. There would be no public firings, no humiliations. Those who failed simply would not advance. Marshall believed something radical for the time. A commander who rigidly obeyed rules in peacetime might kill thousands in war. And watching from afar was a General Marshall neither trusted nor dismissed, George Smith Patton Jr., a man already walking a political tightrope.
By 1941, George S. Patton was already famous and already dangerous to his own career. He was brilliant, obsessive, and abrasive. He believed war was won through speed, violence of action, and relentless pressure. But he was also theatrical, outspoken, and politically careless. Patton had powerful allies, most notably Dwight D. Eisenhower. Between the wars, Patton and Eisenhower served in the same units. In the evenings, they argued doctrine over maps, running hypothetical armored thrusts across Europe long before tanks ever clashed there. That mattered. Eisenhower understood Patton wasn't reckless. He was thinking faster than doctrine allowed. Marshall knew this too, but Marshall had kept Douglas MacArthur despite worse behavior because MacArthur commanded institutional loyalty. Patton did not. As the maneuvers began, many assumed Patton was being evaluated for removal, not promotion. Then came the moment that changed everything.
In September 1941, Patton was commanding the 2nd Armored Division, tasked with opposing forces during the final phase of the maneuvers. The rules were explicit. Boundaries were fixed. Umpires would halt units declared destroyed. Patton listened and then ignored almost all of it. He identified a flaw no one else exploited. The exercise boundaries were artificial, not tactical. Without authorization, Patton ordered his armored columns to execute a massive end run through Texas, bypassing enemy concentrations, severing communications, and striking command posts from the rear. When umpires attempted to stop him, Patton argued, then moved faster than they could react. At the start of the operation, Patton turned to his staff and said only, "Play ball." Within hours, the opposing army was operationally paralyzed. On paper, Patton had cheated. In reality, he had demonstrated exactly how a real enemy would behave, and Marshall took note.
Patton's Texas end run immediately ignited controversy. Umpires filed formal protests. Several senior officers argued that Patton had invalidated the exercise by violating its rules. To them, discipline mattered more than outcome. An exercise, they insisted, must be won properly. But Marshall saw something else. The Louisiana-Texas maneuvers were not designed merely to test compliance. They were designed to test judgment under uncertainty. Officers who waited for permission failed. Officers who moved slowly failed. Patton had exposed what Marshall privately called the dinosaurs, commanders who obeyed the rule book while losing imaginary wars exactly as they would lose real ones. This was not unlike later historical warnings. Before Midway, Japanese war games had sidelined officers who broke assumptions and paid the price. Patton's violation did not embarrass the Army. It embarrassed the men who could not keep up.
In Washington, Marshall faced a decision that would never appear in official records. Formally punishing Patton would send a message: discipline above innovation. Protecting him would send another: results matter more than comfort. Marshall was no romantic admirer of Patton. He disliked Patton's theatrics and feared his mouth could sabotage alliances. But Marshall also understood timing. Removing Patton in 1941 would mean replacing him with someone slower, safer, and less suited for modern war. In a looming global conflict, that risk was unacceptable. This was the same logic that explained why Marshall tolerated MacArthur despite repeated insubordination. The difference was leverage. MacArthur had public stature. Patton had utility. Marshall chose not to reward Patton, but he chose not to destroy him either. Patton would be watched closely, but for now, he would survive.
It is a myth that Patton was protected because he was popular. He wasn't. Among peers, Patton was tolerated at best, resented at worst. His ego, language, and contempt for mediocrity made enemies easily. Had he failed in Texas, Marshall would not have hesitated. What saved Patton was not personality, it was demonstrated adaptability. Unlike officers who froze when rules collapsed, Patton treated uncertainty as an opportunity. He moved logistics, communications, and armor simultaneously, exactly what modern war required. Marshall did not need saints. He needed commanders who could think faster than chaos. Patton proved that, even if he proved little else. But this fragile protection came with a cost. One public failure, one scandal, and the protection would vanish. That moment would come sooner than anyone expected.
2 years later, Patton would do in combat exactly what he had done in Texas. In North Africa, 1942-1943, Patton restored a shattered U.S. Army by imposing speed, discipline, and relentless movement. In Sicily, his controversial maneuvers again broke expectations and again angered superiors. By then, Marshall understood the pattern. Patton was not a safe general, but he was a necessary one. The Texas end run was no anomaly. It was a preview. When Patton later crossed boundaries, defied expectations, and forced outcomes, Marshall remembered 1941. And each time, the same calculation returned. Removing Patton mid-crisis would be more dangerous than tolerating him. That single illegal maneuver years earlier had quietly rewritten his fate.
By July 1943, Patton's methods were no longer theoretical. During the Allied invasion of Sicily, he commanded the U.S. 7th Army under Eisenhower's overall authority. Officially, Patton's role was limited: protect the British flank and advance cautiously. Instead, Patton moved aggressively west, then north, racing British forces toward Palermo and Messina. He stretched logistics, ignored implied boundaries, and forced momentum where none had been planned. Militarily, it worked. Politically, it was disastrous. Patton embarrassed allies, antagonized Montgomery, and created command friction Eisenhower could not ignore. Once again, Patton had achieved results the wrong way. The pattern from Texas repeated, only now the consequences were public. This time, protection would not be automatic.
In August 1943, Patton crossed a line no doctrine could excuse. At a field hospital in Sicily, Patton struck 2 soldiers suffering from combat exhaustion, accusing them of cowardice. Word spread quickly. Witnesses reported the incidents. Medical officers protested. When Eisenhower learned what had happened, he was furious. This was no longer about tactics. This was about command judgment, the kind that could fracture an army. For a moment, Patton's career hung by a thread. Many expected Marshall to finally act. But Marshall remembered Texas. He knew Patton's value in motion, not in peace. Removing him permanently would eliminate a tool America would soon need. The punishment was severe, but temporary. Patton was sidelined, not destroyed. In early 1944, as plans for D-Day accelerated, Patton found himself without a command. Publicly, he was disgraced. Privately, he was indispensable. Marshall and Eisenhower understood something the Germans would soon learn the hard way. Patton's reputation was a weapon. They placed him in command of the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, a force that did not exist. Patton moved visibly, issued orders, inspected units, and made noise. German intelligence took the bait. They believed Patton would lead the main invasion at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Once again, Patton was being used not for obedience, but for initiative and unpredictability, the same qualities first revealed in Texas. The general nearly purged in 1941 now shaped the outcome of the war without firing a shot.
Looking back, the Texas end run was not about breaking rules. It was about revealing truths. Patton exposed how rigid systems fail under pressure, how innovation threatens hierarchy, and how war punishes those who wait for permission. Marshall never praised Patton for Texas. He never formally excused him either. He simply remembered. When later crises came, Sicily, the slapping incidents, political embarrassment, Marshall's earlier calculation held. Patton had already proven he understood modern war before America had entered it. The illegal maneuver did not save Patton because it was clever. It saved him because it was right. And that quiet decision in 1941 echoed across every battlefield Patton would later cross.
It is tempting to see the Second World War through the lens of its most dramatic commanders. But this was Marshall's war, not Patton's. Marshall never sought brilliance for its own sake. He sought systems that could survive failure. Patton, for all his excesses, fit into that system, not as a model, but as an exception that proved its limits. The Texas end run forced Marshall to confront an uncomfortable truth. Doctrine cannot anticipate every battlefield reality. Someone must be allowed to test the edges. Marshall never institutionalized Patton's behavior. He contained it. That distinction mattered. Patton was permitted to succeed only when his success served the system, never when it threatened it. This balance between control and chaos defined American command throughout the war. While Patton survived, dozens of other generals quietly vanished from command. Between 1940 and 1942, Marshall removed or sidelined more than 600 senior officers, one of the most sweeping leadership purges in American military history. There were no announcements. Officers were reassigned, retired early, or simply not promoted. Most had followed rules perfectly. Most had failed the test Marshall actually cared about: adaptation. Patton stood out not because he was reckless, but because he forced outcomes. He revealed weaknesses in others by moving faster than they could respond. The Texas maneuver did not merely save Patton. It helped identify who could not be trusted with armies when the real war arrived.
There is a reason many veterans believe a modern Patton would not survive today's military. World War II existed at a unique moment when institutions were forced to tolerate dangerous individuals because the alternative was strategic collapse. Today's military prizes process, communication, and political alignment. In 1941, Marshall prized outcomes. Patton thrived in that narrow window. He required superiors strong enough to restrain him and wars large enough to justify his risks. Without both, Patton would have been unmanageable. Marshall understood this. That is why Patton was never given supreme command, and why his power always stopped short of independence. The system used him, but never became him. With hindsight, the Texas end run appears less rebellious than revealing. Patton did not break the rules to win an exercise. He broke them to demonstrate their limits. Marshall did not excuse the act. He absorbed its lesson. That is why the maneuver mattered. It forced the U.S. Army to confront a central paradox of war. The qualities that make a peacetime officer safe can make a wartime commander deadly to his own side. Patton survived not because he was right all the time, but because in 1941 he was right sooner than everyone else. And that single illegal decision echoed far beyond Texas, shaping how America would fight its largest war.
When the war ended in May 1945, the urgency that had protected men like Patton disappeared almost overnight. The U.S. Army shifted from survival to governance. Discipline, diplomacy, and restraint once again mattered more than speed. Patton struggled in this environment. His comments about former Nazis, his impatience with occupation duties, and his refusal to adapt to political realities alarmed superiors. The same traits that made him valuable in combat now made him unstable in peace. Marshall, by then preparing to retire, did not intervene. The calculation had changed. The war no longer required Patton's particular genius, and the system could no longer justify its risks.
George C. Marshall never publicly defended Patton. He also never publicly condemned him. In private correspondence and post-war reflections, Marshall described Patton as essential in war, unsuitable in peace, a distinction that explains every decision made since 1941. Marshall believed institutions must outlast individuals. No commander, no matter how brilliant, could be allowed to define the system. That is why Patton was used decisively and then allowed to fade. Marshall's protection had never been personal, it had been conditional. The Texas end run had earned Patton a place in war, not immunity forever. On December 9, 1945, Patton was seriously injured in an automobile accident near Mannheim, Germany. He died 12 days later, on December 21, at the age of 60. With his death, the debate ended, but the legend began. Patton would never face court-martial, retirement, or reconciliation with peacetime norms. History would remember him at his peak, aggressive, uncompromising, victorious. But those closest to power remembered something else. They remembered a man who walked the edge of acceptability and survived only because war demanded it. The Texas end run did not rewrite doctrine overnight, but it changed something more subtle. It taught the U.S. Army that rules exist to be tested, not worshipped. That innovation often looks like insubordination before it looks like success. Marshall never encouraged others to copy Patton. He encouraged them to think faster than the enemy. That lesson endured in armored warfare, air-ground coordination, and command flexibility. Patton was not the model. He was the warning and the proof.
So how did Patton's illegal Texas end run save him from Marshall's purge? Not by defiance, by relevance. In 1941, Patton demonstrated something rare, the ability to see past rules to outcomes, past doctrine to reality. Marshall recognized that removing such a man before war would weaken the Army more than enduring him. Patton was never forgiven. He was used. And when the war no longer required him, the protection ended. That is the truth behind the legend, not of a rule breaker rewarded, but of an institution strong enough to tolerate danger when survival demanded it.